Welcome back to Homeward Bound. This is episode 12, covering books 23 and 24. This is a podcast where a couple nerds read through and discuss the Iliad and the Odyssey. That information was presented in a weird order, but nonetheless, you now have all of it, thanks to my brilliant memory and skill in information presentation. I'm Wriste.
I am Llama.
And
here we are.
As I was about to say, like, directly before we started, before I stopped myself, like, yeah, I'll say this here. I was looking forward to ending our discussion of the Iliad by saying, man, this is our last conversation that we'll have on the Iliad. But that is not true. Time will be convoluted for anyone who's listening to our podcast in chronological order. We had recorded episode 11. We've been recording everything in chronological order thus far. And we had recorded episode 11, sort of, but there was a technical difficulty, which unfortunately resulted in the loss of a guest who's a good friend. He's not dead or anything. We just lost the conversation.
He's very much alive.
They did not pass as a result of having a conversation with us, although there's a non-zero chance of that happening with anyone. And yeah, that conversation is lost to time.
Unfortunately. So very, very unfortunately.
Yes. So although I will, of course, be quite happy to call upon that conversation we had, which, as I said, is lost to time, it will not exist. If you are here from the episode 11 discussion that we will have had with Dr. Daniel, who was kind enough to come back on as a guest for that one, for us to rehab that conversation. This one was recorded before that. And as we'll say in that one was recorded after this one. So it's kind of in reverse. It's confusing me already, so just know that, unfortunately, our discussion on the last episode was lost, and the one that you had heard is not the one that we originally had. Welcome back to episode 12 of Homeward Bound, a podcast where a couple nerds read through and discuss Homer's Iliad and Odyssey. This episode will cover the final two books of the Iliad, books 23 and 24. And yeah, I'm Wriste.
I am Llama. Here we are at
Hello,
the
Llama.
end of the Iliad.
Yes, and this is our second take at the start, at starting this episode, but I'll repeat myself since the only person I'm repeating myself for is actually Llama. I was looking forward to saying that, I'm happy to have gotten to the end of the Iliad, to have, for this to be our last conversation. But that's not true, because all of our episode 11 footage was lost, along with the footage of our guest, who unfortunately does not have time to come back on because he's going back to uni. So
Very,
even
very
though that conversation,
sad about that.
yeah, even though that conversation will live on in our hearts, it was a great conversation about books 21 and 22. It will not be for you. It'll just be for us. And if you're here from episode 11, that episode was recorded after this one with Dr. Daniel. So this information will only serve to confuse as opposed to clarify. But I figured it was important to say for no other reason than it's bugging me that no one else will know if we don't
I think
talk
it
about
would have also bugged me if no one else had known. But I also think it's kind of important to mention it just because, we may end up referring offhandedly to something that we talked about without even kind of realizing it. So just in case that happens,
we'll try to be mindful of continuity. Yes.
That being said, we made it. We've made it to the end of the Iliad. We still have an Odyssey ahead of us. See what I did there?
Yes.
But this is exciting.
A full new adventure.
This is so exciting.
No, it's weird how quickly and how slowly it went at the same time. Like, we're here, so obviously it feels like it's happened quickly. at the same time, we've been recording this over the course of a month and a half, which is a decent chunk of time. Uh, and we've talked off camera about the brisk pace of our recording and how it's very it's more demanding than at least I anticipated it would
Oh,
be.
definitely than I
Uh,
anticipated either. But like in a good way. This has been really
yeah, yeah.
fun, and I've found myself kind of both surprised by like, oh, it's Sunday already, we're going to be recording, but also excited for that because it's another chance
Mhm.
to talk about these books, which have been such fascinating conversations. So, yeah.
Yeah, indeed. But yeah, well, after this, of course, we'll be recording episode 11, but we'll also the next chronological episode, episode 13. We will start on the Odyssey, which is equally exciting. We'll have Dr. Daniel on for that as well. Since we're sort of hopping translations, uh, we've been reading. In case you've forgotten or missed it, we've been reading the Robert Fagles translation for the Iliad, and while Fagles does have a translation for the Odyssey, we'll be reading Dr. Emily Wilson's translation for the Odyssey, which is like a really recent translation. It's only like 3 years old or
Yeah,
something
it
like
is
that.
very, very recent. And it's so different. I'm very
Yes.
excited to get into kind of a conversation about just the differences in tone and style and all of that good stuff. All of that good, juicy stuff about, just how different a translation can make something feel. As
Yeah.
I
And
mean, as we've even seen, with comments that Dr. Dan has made in his tags about this translation of the
mhm.
Iliad, it just there is so much that goes into it.
Yeah. On that note, I was thinking about how like how each translation imparts tone. Yeah, I'm not super familiar with. I mean, I'm not familiar at all with any of the other translations. I've probably peeked at a few. I know I've read lines of other translations of the Iliad, but in our lost conversation with our friend, we talked about a little bit between the differences between the Fagles translation and the I think it's the Lattimore
Lattimore, yeah.
translation, and how even then how much tone I guess Fagles has imparted in his translation of the Iliad,
Yeah,
uh,
absolutely.
which is
Seems like there's a little more pepper, a little more flavor to the
yeah, it's
Fagles
a little bit
translation.
spicier.
So it's really fascinating to me. I mean, I studied history and I studied a lot of European history, and translation comes into that a lot because there's so much that gets lost between translation from another language to English to begin with. But then it also depends on who the translator is. So it's fascinating stuff to me.
And as people who have we were both as we mentioned before involved in a project where we read the Iliad aloud. We read this
Yeah,
read Fagles translation aloud. That's also like imparting tone is also a feature of the performer or the poet, I
absolutely.
guess.
And as we continue to talk about this as part of the oral tradition, like that also applies completely. It's not only a translation from, Greek to English, but there's also, the translation that in the Greek, when performers were doing this,
Hmm.
from page to word, like spoken word. So
Hmm.
it just it goes such a long way into crafting the image that you get. Like when I read, I kind of try and form an image of in my head, and that image
Hmm.
can change so much based on what is on the page, and what is on the page can differ so much depending on who wrote it down.
You talk about seeing an image as you read. I imagine that for us who are more we just read regular books and stuff. Like when we read this, we're trying to imagine the scene as we would in like a regular book if you're reading just prose. But if you're a translator, or maybe if you're a little bit more mindful, perhaps you would, instead of seeing what's being described, you would imagine a person saying these lines instead. and that would be the scene. So you're like one layer deeper,
Oh, absolutely.
which I of course do not imagine. I don't imagine an old man reciting these words when I read them. I imagine like Achilles saying these things, and the 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 poet's comments or scene settings are just like how you'd read regular narration. So I don't know how you're supposed to read these in any case.
I don't think there is any one set way,
Yeah, I'd imagine
you know?
not. But let's before we spend any more time on nonsense, let's get
Content warning.
into let's get into our really quickly content warning. We haven't said any bad words yet, so this is the bad words warning. We say bad words. Sometimes we'll make an off-color joke. Or
There's
I'll
some
make an off-color joke.
there's some violence in the books. Yeah. I don't know. I've been known to make an off-color joke every now
Yes.
and then, I'm not immune from being foul-mouthed or minded.
There's a bit of Thersites in all of us.
There is a little bit of Thersites in all of us, indeed. Let us hope that we don't get beat for it like he did.
Well, let's get into book 23, which is it's not a weird book. But first encountering it for me was a little weird because it's such a long book
It is a long
about
book.
this is called Funeral Games, excuse me, for Patroclus. And there's a little bit of preamble to the games, which we'll get into, but the games take up a majority of the book. And having gone from, at least in my memory, in the first couple of times I read it, it was always a weird shift in tone.
Oh
I
yeah.
guess change of pace.
Well, it's interesting because like again, there is a little bit of preamble before the games go into full swing, but you're going from one of the absolutely heaviest, most tense parts of the book into and they're off to the races. It's, Antilochus by a nose. And it's a very interesting swing in tone, and it's a very interesting kind of commentary on like again, we keep talking about ritual, or I keep talking about ritual at least, but it's one of these ritual type things that I think for modern people might seem out of place, but was obviously probably a very, very big part of life back then. Would be to have these funeral games, these kind of sporting events after someone has died to kind of honor the dead. I guess this was probably like, an overall pretty military related thing.
Maybe. I mean, it wouldn't do me much good to speculate since this is clearly they're clearly cultural
Yeah.
uh aspects holding all of this together that are impenetrable to me aside from I guess just guessing. As you said, like that obviously this is done to honor the dead. This is done to honor Patroclus specifically. This isn't done for anyone else, as best as I can see. Whole
No,
funeral games for
it isn't.
just whomever. So this is very special. This is more than just something that they would do, which in a way makes it separates it from ritual, if you want to look at it that way, because ritual is something that, at least by my estimation, ritual is something that you do
For
like sort of
everyone.
regularly, rote for maybe not for everyone, but something that has like a set, or maybe it is ritualistic. I guess maybe this is something maybe this is the sort of games or the sort of event you would throw for someone who was really, really important to you.
Yeah.
Like I wouldn't pay for a funeral for someone whom I didn't like, for an acquaintance, right? I'd throw
Yeah.
one for a close friend or a family member, and so in that case, maybe it is. I don't know. I hadn't really thought of this in terms of ritual. As you can see, I'm working through it in real time.
Hey, I mean, this is what happens, you bring something up and sometimes like, I don't know, I know you've brought stuff up that I was just like, oh, I have to
Mhm.
think about this. And I know that we had at least I think we'll probably get to this more towards the end, but I know I had put a pin and at least one question that you had for me
Mhm.
about kind of overall themes in the Iliad. So I'm looking forward to getting back to that later.
Yeah, yeah.
But,
At the very least, yeah, at the very least, no one's like, "What? We're playing like games?" Like
yeah, no one is
everyone seems to be going
confused by
along with
this.
it.
This
There's
seems
like,
like something that has occurred before, will occur again, something
it seems
that
like an
they're used
option.
to. Yeah.
Um, yeah. So before we get too far into the games, we can back up to the pre-game. There's some things I want to talk about Achilles that I don't want to get into book until book 24 because that's the final book. It's one where we're going to do our best to wrap things up, and so I don't want to spoil that. However, or not spoil it, but talk about it now and then talk about it then. That'd be kind of redundant and weird. But what is, I think, the most significant scene beforehand is obviously, or before the funeral games, is Achilles encountering Patroclus in his sleep.
The dream.
I believe.
Or,
Yeah.
what seems like a dream, but also seems more real than a dream, even.
The word dream isn't, at least it's not rendered in this directly. The text says, no sooner had sleep caught him, dissolving all his grief. This is line 72. Dissolving all his grief, as mists of refreshing slumber poured around him there. His powerful frame was bone weary, blah, blah, blah. Then the ghost of stricken Patroclus drifted up. And this is a fairly well known and well cited scene. I don't, thankfully, I don't spend too much time on Twitter, but what little time I have spent, I have run into some like quotes from this scene, this exchange between Achilles and Patroclus.
I can imagine that this has been one of the more thoroughly pored over passages in the Iliad.
Mm-hmm. So as a modern viewer, I am forced to ask the question, what what do we make of this dream? This is a dream, or rather it happens in a dream, but is this, I guess the better question is this real? Is that even a question that like should be considered, or because this happens the poem makes explicit that this is happening in a dream. It's not happen in his waking hours where he can see with his eyes. This is something that happens in his mind, or maybe in his mind, I don't know, as he's sleeping, and then it dissipates when he wakes up. Do you have any I guess reads on this in particular?
I mean, I
that
think
question, I guess.
I don't know, because I think the biggest thing I take away from this is two things that I take away from this. First of all, this is Patroclus spurring Achilles on into completing the death rituals. This is him, begging him to complete the death rituals and let him be at peace. And also to ensure that they are planned or destined to be together in the afterlife, because he asks him also to bury his bones with him when Achilles dies, as he
Yes.
knows is going to happen and as Achilles knows is going to happen. And that brings me to the second takeaway, is his reminder to Achilles that his day of fate is at hand. Just as Patroclus is now in the house of death, Achilles is going to join him soon, and he knows that. And this is kind of him reminding Achilles of that. What to take away from that, I'm not sure.
So if you'll cast your mind back a little bit in time to when you watched The Last Jedi in theaters, which you certainly did, I'm assuming.
Oh, yes, absolutely.
So did I. We don't have to talk about like the quality of the film or what to take away from it. That's another podcast that will never happen. I guess this is mild spoilers for The Last Jedi. But toward the end of the movie, there is an apparition, not exactly the same as Patroclus, because the owner of the apparition, the figure of the apparition, is still alive. It's Luke Skywalker, who has appeared on the battlefield and is performing these combat miracles. But it turns out that this is actually just like they don't know it's an apparition until I can't remember exactly what happens. Maybe he gets stabbed or and it goes right through him or something. I don't remember exactly what the cause is. But beforehand, you can kind of tell it's an apparition because he doesn't leave any footprints when he walks, and most notably, his appearance is fixed in time. He has less gray in his hair. He's using a different lightsaber, a lightsaber that he would have used when he was younger, and he's wearing robes that he would have worn when he was younger. And when the Iliad, going back to the Iliad, out of Last Jedi, it describes Patroclus. It says, the ghost of stricken Patroclus drifted up. He was like the man to the life, every feature, the same tall build, and the fine eyes and voice, and the very robes that used to clothe his body. If I am to suspect that this is a grief-stricken Achilles calling up to himself the image of his friend, this he would imagine him this way. He would imagine him as wearing what he'd worn and looking as he'd looked.
I think that absolutely fits because I think we've kind of talked before about like this dichotomy between what Achilles knows his fate is to be and what could have been. You know, we kind of talked about this with the idea of the shield of Achilles being the choices that could have been made, the life that he could have lived, you know, that potential that is lost when he decides to enter into the fray again. So I think it's almost kind of fitting. And to kind of get back to the question of like, is this a dream? Is this reality? Is this an actual ghost? Maybe it's a dream, but who's to say that a dream is any less real, you know? And especially as Achilles would have interpreted, you know, even if he knows it's not entirely real, this is a real image of Patroclus that he has conjured up.
Mm-hmm.
So it's, you know, it's interesting. I didn't really think before about the kind of difference between Patroclus as, you know, a dead person and that image and this image of him in the dream.
So I will reveal my ulterior motives also for suggesting that this is a phantom of Achilles' mind as opposed to a true phantom. When we spoke about how I view the relationship between Patroclus and Achilles, I feel as though there's trouble. It makes me think that there would at least be some trouble or difficulty with Patroclus on the Patroclus end of the relationship. Whether this is something I can purely take credit for, or if I am just re-rationalizing the interpretation of their relationship from Hades, which is actually where Patroclus is bitter toward Achilles off in the afterlife, which, again, given everything that happened, makes a lot of sense. This is the thing that people usually point to say that their relationship was strong both ways, or that there was a strong enough relationship both ways that these issues that I might read into their relationship based on what I think is happening and the sorts of people I'm reading them as, those issues would not exist, or those issues would be minimized. And so I'm torn between my understanding of the relationship pre this exchange and after this exchange, because this exchange speaks against how I see them. This is the only exception for me, and I'm having trouble grappling with it. So those are my ulterior motives.
That's interesting. I think I kind of see it as like, I think your interpretation can exist even with this exchange, and here's why. Because I think,
Okay.
when you have a relationship with someone, even if it is marred by some conflict or tension or whatever, there are things that can happen in life, big events that can let you kind of ignore that that tension happened, which is to say that great acts, great great
Like dying, for
events
instance.
such as, dying, just a little
Mm.
thing like dying, can go a long way to kind of make you forget that, or not forget, but just not need to dwell on what conflict there was before.
Hmm. I can see that. I've given that some consideration, and I'm still not sure how to feel about it. I'm not sure if I'll ever really know truly how to feel about it. 'Cause again, this is just as a modern reader, I'm unsure of how to interpret this message in a dream. Uh, we've encountered at least one instance where a message in a dream was clearly not the real thing, but it was also real in the sense that the person who sent the dream got what they wanted. So I don't know. It's
I think that's a
it is impenetrable to me.
fascinating little conundrum you've weaved for yourself there.
Yeah, yeah. I don't know. Perhaps nah, no one knows
I
for
don't know.
sure.
I
All right, let's.
personally think that death has kind of released them of the tension that there potentially once was there, and that Patroclus, if this is indeed a phantom, Patroclus now sees Achilles grieving over him and refusing to let him go, and is basically telling him, like, hey, chill out.
Hmm,
I loved you in life, even if there were bad things going on, and I love you now in
yeah.
death. By the way, bury me with you and chill the fuck out. And also, please, can you bury me? Like, I would really, really like to actually go chill with Hades.
And just as well, these are all things that I could just as easily see Achilles, for lack of a better word, his subconscious or what have you, is telling him through the medium of sleep.
Yeah, I think it
Yeah,
works
that's
either way, you know?
it does, which is bothersome. So,
It
so
is
we'll
bothersome, isn't it?
yes, to me, but yeah, that's the rub. Um, he has this dream. It is yeah, regardless of whether it is real or not. As I've said before, I believe that I've been hard on Achilles, but I believe that his love for Patroclus is real, and this, if
As do
anything,
I.
is a demonstration that Achilles clearly feels very strongly for Patroclus.
So
Uh,
I know we've, for the most part, have kind of tried to keep the Iliad project out of this and let it be its own thing. But I do want to mention
uh,
that this was one of the books that I read for the Iliad project, and this
yes.
dream was the source of the most trouble that I had during the entire thing because of this ambiguity. Because
Hmm.
it is so like difficult to interpret and kind of assign what
Hmm.
exactly is going on here. So I love that we're talking about this now because it
Hmm.
flummoxed me. Like it genuinely like I was like, how do I read this? Because it's also such an important part of the book and the story overall, I think. This is such a
Hmm.
like poignant moment towards the end of the Iliad. So I love that we get to
Yeah.
talk about this now. It stumped me, and I had to go back and redo it more than once.
And as I said, if anything, it speaks for where Achilles' head is at,
Yeah,
which is
it,
still
it
very
really does.
much yeah. So once we move on from that, we have the funeral itself, which isn't. I guess we could talk about it if we want to, but I feel like this is sort of nerd material. Like people who are interested in like the customs and the culture and I guess the rituals would be interested in because there's a lot of building stuff and building of pyres
Building
and
of fires, sacrifices, the
sacrificing and all
cutting
that
of the
stuff.
lock of his hair, which I actually, okay, so the cutting of
Hmm.
the lock of Achilles' hair
Yes.
interested me because I know we've talked before about how there aren't really that many physical representations of like any of the characters, but really of
Mhm.
Achilles. And he has red gold hair. It says that he cuts the red gold lock he'd let grow long as a gift to the river god Sparcius. And I was like, hey, a little nugget of like physical description. It's at line like
Oh, I missed that. Yeah, no, I see it now. Yeah.
163. And I was rereading it again, for prep, and I was just like, hey, that is a descriptor, like a real one.
Although, although I will refer to Dr. Daniel's tags or
Oh,
a couple Dr.
absolutely,
Daniel's
in the
tags
sense that
where
like
he's just yeah, I can't remember what the
I
word
think
is,
the
but he
Greek
said
word
it's still
can refer to like golden, or not
yeah.
necessarily as
Can also have tones of red or what have
yeah,
you.
specific. I like to think of it as like auburn.
Yeah, or it could be a sort of I mean, Fagles chooses to translate Menelaus, for instance, as being red
The
haired, even
red-haired
though
Menelaus, yeah.
as best as I can understand, this is the same sort of word or the same kind of descriptor that you'd use to
I
describe someone
think
who's blonde. So,
is very likely. So, in any case, I was fascinated to see that. It just popped out to
mhm.
me on that last reread, and I was like, wait a minute, wait just a
Yeah, here
minute.
here is something concrete. There's also, I guess, there's also a little part where, and again, I'm not totally sure what the logistics are of a funeral pyre, but there's a part where the pyre isn't burning, and he has to pray to the winds to get it going.
Yeah,
I'm
that
not
was
totally
wild.
sure what the yeah I guess again lacking like definitive concrete details. It's just interesting, I guess, that the gods are getting involved. I mean, the gods have already been involved. You know, they've been keeping Patroclus fresh, um, and all that, and now they're helping the funeral pyring along as well. So with Iris sending the message to the winds, and the winds are like, oh, okay, sure, we'll do it. If and and then
I
we
think
get the
it's also
pyre.
important to mention that not only are they keeping Patroclus's body fresh, but they are also keeping Hector's body from
Yes.
being consumed and dragged, because one of the things that this mentions at some point, I don't remember exactly where it is basically this, like, whenever Achilles is sad, he like gets up and gets Hector's body and just drags it around a few times, and then that makes him feel
Yeah.
better, and then he stops, which is so
I,
disturbing.
I I cannot help but think of like a dog who gets sad and like has to go find their favorite chew toy or whatever.
Absolutely. That is exactly what it reminds me of. It's just like, oh my god, this man is a monster.
he he is not so good at coping with loss.
Achilles does
That
not
is
grieve gently.
trying to find the part where it says that. I can't find it off the top of my head, but yeah, I do remember that. Maybe it's in the next book or something. I don't
It's
know.
possible, it is possible that it's in the next book. I just remembered that it mentioned it somewhere because it talks about him, and I'm pretty sure it says he drags it around 3 times, like in 3 circles. And it stuck out to me because we have had discussions about the number 3 and its significance before.
Yes,
And this was
that's actually what I
yet
was looking for too.
yet
If
another
that number
example of
was
that. But I think it's possible it's in book 24.
it certainly could be. But let's get to the more titular aspects of this book, which is the funeral
It's
games
the Olympics.
themselves.
Dun, dun, dun,
It's
dun,
the
dun, dun.
Olympics. I'm just fairly are the Olympics still going?
No,
It's
they're
August
over.
18th. Is it over?
They're
Okay.
over, yeah.
I don't follow the Olympics. I know they have been going on, but I don't
I
know.
like the gymnastics and diving.
I have I have very little interest, I'll be honest.
Very fair.
Um I mean, if we did chariot racing like they did here, maybe I'd watch. I think that'd be pretty
I
cool
would
to watch.
love to see chariot races. I will say that the games in this book sound like quite fun. And there's food, there's like feasting, there's all kinds of
Yeah.
stuff going on.
There's a lot of there are a lot of events mentioned. I personally would like to focus on two of them. If there's another one that you'd like to focus on, feel free to
I have a feeling we're going
interject
to
right
want to
up.
focus on the same ones.
Well, the one I want to focus on first is the chariot race,
Oh yeah.
which I think is the longest of all the events by far. It's rendered in like 300 to 400 lines in Fagles' translation.
Half of which
It is
are
a
like Nestor talking.
only a little bit.
Or are you
He
talking
gives some
just about the race itself? I mean, the race itself is
the
quite
race
long.
itself. Yes, there's Diomedes, there's Antilochus, there's Meriones, and there's Menelaus, and there's
Eumelus.
Eumelus, poor guy. And even though there's a lot going on, it can be summarized fairly easily. 5 racers, they race, and the gods intervene, and Diomedes wins, and Antilochus comes in second, Menelaus comes in third, Meriones, who apparently isn't very good at racing horses, comes in fourth, and Eumelus, who did have a good team, but his chariot was smashed by the gods, comes in last.
Oh, those pesky gods. One thing I love about the chariot race, which happens before it starts, is that Achilles is like, my team should participate and we'd win, but the horses are sad because Patroclus is dead.
There is
Horses are so emotional in the Iliad.
They're not only emotional, they're intelligent.
They are quite intelligent.
Or at least according to the poet, there are a couple instances where the racers outright threaten their horses with death and violence if they don't speed up. And the poet says that they are like frightened or scared by their owner's threats, and they give it their all.
Yeah, they are in in concert with their riders. They understand them. Also, of slight funnies note by me was the part where Atrides, where Menelaus literally says, "Hold your horses."
That's gotta be Fagles just having
It's
fun.
absolutely
Like,
a Fagles
absolutely must
translation
be.
thing. It has to be.
I don't
But
even need to
I
see the Greek.
cracked up. It just says, Antilochus, you drive like a maniac. Hold your horses. And I just lost it. I absolutely lost it.
I had another this is off topic, but I had another epiphany reading the Iliad. I can't remember where it is. But someone said, like, they were talking about someone being a lance for hire, a freelance. And I was like, oh, freelancers. Huh. Is that where that comes
It's
from?
like the wheels are turning.
It finally connects. Even though the two words are right there and I could separate them, like a freelancer. Freelance. Like that I didn't make the connection until they
It's the thing. They said the thing. It's freelance.
it makes
It's
sense.
a freelance. Yeah, I love picking up on little things like that in the Iliad. There have been a few times that has happened for me as
It's
well.
fun. And of course, I'm never totally sure if it is a product of the translation or if it's a product of my own human pattern finding mind turning its gears, but
Yep.
it's always enjoyable nonetheless. So there are a couple things about the games and this race in particular that I think are worth pointing out. One, primarily, is the involvement of the gods. Remember when we were I can't remember the name of it again, even though Dr. Daniel mentioned it, because he knew what I was talking about. It was that little satirical poem about the mice versus the frogs, and how the gods got involved in that.
If I recall correctly from his tag, that's basically the translation of the story, is like the story of the frogs and the mice.
Yes, yeah, that was the name, only in
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 Greek,
Greek, so
ancient
I
Greek,
don't know what it
which
is.
neither of us, yeah, no.
No, but this has feelings of that. The gods are just as involved in these sort of. This is probably the most civil matter that we've seen in the entire Iliad. These are different nations coming together for competition and fellowship and winning and earning of prizes, and there's politics, and regardless of whether it's on the battlefield or if it's like at home where these sort of celebratory things are happening, the gods are super active. They're taking whips out of people's hands and they're smashing yokes and they're doing all these things to affect this stupid chariot race.
Yeah, the gods really just like messing with the mortals, I think.
I think it. So, we'll get. I'll save it for book 24. But the gods are such an integral part of Greek life that I think it's easy for us to forget that even though we're watching these gods involved in all these great martial affairs, that they're just as interested in like the everydayness. And there's the archery competition between Teucer and Meriones.
Yeah.
Teucer doesn't promise a great sacrifice to Apollo, and so he misses the dove. But Meriones,
I think it just stands to reason that they they are the gods. They're overseeing every facet of the life of mortals. So why shouldn't they be involved in the silly things too?
Yeah, and I mean, I guess to extend that in broader terms, is the second thing that I think is very interesting about these games is that Achilles is the one who's presiding over them. If we are to take very, very seriously the images he's holding on his shield and the message that Hephaestus is giving us, that there are all these facets of Greek life, this is the non-war part of Greek life that Achilles is involved in. This is him cashing in on being not a warrior. He is not a man killer in this book. His role is of judge and of leader in a way. He's being royalty. He's more royal than Agamemnon in this particular book.
I'm sorry, I just got a look on my face because and you guys can't see this, but Wriste can, because all I could think in that moment was it's his party and he'll cry if he wants to. Which is kind of like what this is, honestly. It's
the thing. Like he
is hosting this funeral
cry.
Well, no, he doesn't, but he talks about how his horses are mopey because Patroclus is dead. So like, using the term liberally.
Mm-hmm.
Because he doesn't actually cry, but he does frequently reference his grief. And after the chariot race, we have all this fallout because people are fighting over prizes and who tripped whom up and who spoiled whose car, and people are and even during the race when the spectators are bickering about who's taking the curve, and Achilles has to be like, shut up, I'm grieving. This is not the time to trade insults. This is a serious thing. And so it's his party, and he'll cry if he wants to.
Yeah, but it's not so it's also not so lawless as that. I think a really cool interesting part, like following the chariot race, as you said, there's some fallout. Antilochus, by the way, totally sure what the real implications are here. He cuts Menelaus off, or threatens major damage during the race to Menelaus. Maybe he occupies part of his track, but Antilochus and Menelaus have to sort of sort out their different. Oh wait, no, hold on. I'm gonna back up. There's a Eumelus, right? Eumelus is seen coming in last, and Achilles feels bad for him because he knows that he's a good racer, and that this was really unfortunate. And so he says that he'll give a second place prize to Antilochus, if I remember, or the second place prize to him as opposed to Antilochus, if I remember correctly, right?
Yeah, it's let's give him a prize, it's only right, but second prize, of course, Tydides' son must carry off the first.
Yes, Diomedes has to take first prize because he won, but the second place prize can go
To Eumelus, who he feels bad for. And Antilochus is having absolutely none of this, which I found
yes.
really ironic considering he's like kind of bitching about, having his prize stripped from him from the guy who withdrew all of his aid to the Achaeans because of having his prize stripped from him by Agamemnon. There is a like
That's many
sick
layers.
yeah, there are layers of irony in this which had me kind of cracking up. So I'm like, oh, do you really want to say that to him? Or like maybe he'll relate to it. Maybe he's just like, yeah, you know what? Having your prize stripped from you sucks. I know about that. That's why a bunch of your people died.
Mhm. Yeah, and so he gets out an extra gift for Eumelus as opposed to giving away the second place prize. But then there's there's the other conflict that I was getting into before I forgot which one came first, between Antilochus and Menelaus, because Antilochus cut Menelaus off, and there's an interesting there's an exchange that feels familiar, I guess, where Antilochus has, at least by perception, I don't know if this is in reality or not, I don't know what the rules are, but Antilochus has wronged Menelaus, and so Antilochus says that he'll give up his prize to Menelaus, if it means that, if not doing so will mean that he falls in bad favor, and then he gives it to Menelaus, and then the poet describes Menelaus's heart sort of melting and softening, and then Menelaus says, it's my turn to give an apology. I shouldn't have been so mad, and the only reason you did what you did is because you're young, and I'll give you back your horse. And so it's it feels familiar. I feel like we've seen Achilles and Agamemnon sort of try to juggle these apologies and fail, and Antilochus and Menelaus are doing it very quickly in real time over
Yeah.
something that's lower stakes.
It's much lower stakes. But it is. I feel like there are a few instances where somebody does something like really rash, and then the person who it is done to gets really mad, and then the person who did that thing is just like, oh crap, and then has to backtrack and like, I'm sorry, and the person who was wronged is just like, oh, you know what, it's okay now because you actually said you were sorry, and I really like that. So,
It seems like
apologies
Menelaus is learning from his brother.
apologies seem to be of some difficulty to certain people in this story,
Yes.
namely Achilles, Agamemnon. But for some of these other people, they don't as much. And I wonder if it's true, like you said, like maybe Menelaus is learning a bit from Agamemnon being incapable of rendering an effective apology ever.
And just as well, we've seen a lot of like ransoms and prices paid for insults given, but the only thing that was exchanged in this exchange was the apology. Like I guess the prize that the mare that Antilochus won was given to Menelaus and then given back, but it's not about, in a way, at least in this one, it's not about the thing. It's about the the action, the heart, or the intent behind it that matters
Yeah,
the most,
absolutely.
which seems to be backed up by like almost every ransom attempt in the Iliad ever. It's more, Achilles doesn't want the stuff.
Yeah, he wants the
He wants Agamemnon
apology.
to
He wants the apology and the recognition of what
of
was
wrongdone.
done to wrong him,
Mm.
and actual reconciliation of that by giving his girl back. Like, he wants Briseis back, and he wants the wrong that was done to him in terms of his status. to be fixed. And that is not something that Agamemnon ever offers. And in fact, Agamemnon is usually just like,
He offers
I'll
some
apologize to
Briseis
you by
back.
giving you a bunch of stuff, and sure, you can have Briseis back, but like, you will tell me that I'm the better man at all times. I did nothing wrong. I did nothing wrong. It was my right. And if like, it's like the classic narcissist's approach of, I wasn't wrong, but if I
Well,
was,
to be
it was
clear,
someone else's fault.
Agamemnon has admitted wrongdoing. He just hasn't done it truly in front of Achilles. Done it in front of other people.
This is
He's
true.
never like
But
said it
even
to
when he does
Achilles.
it in front of other people, it's still usually followed up by like, yeah, but this wasn't my fault. Or, this happened. Zeus blinded me. None of
Yes.
there's I don't think there's ever actually a point where he genuinely says like, I really fucked up here.
Maybe, maybe
And
not. I
doesn't
feel like he
doesn't
said
follow
that to
it up with
Nestor.
some kind of.
Yeah, it's one of those things where even if in his heart he knows, his actions sort of need to.
It doesn't ever seem
But neither man
completely
is terribly
genuine,
good at apologies.
No, they're
Yes.
both terrible at it. Although not here.
Yeah, this was a example of, I think, two fairly wise people. Antilochus probably could have. Well, Menelaus threatens to have him swear by Zeus that he raced fairly. And as soon as he does that, Antilochus is like, okay, I'm not going to risk that or do that. I can't lie. So I'll admit the wrong and I'll give it back and I'll give the prize to you. And then Menelaus, in what seems to be a fairly, if not wise, then like cordial move, even if it is just for like good PR, he gives the mare back. He's like, and he offers up an apology of his own, which is actually something like I have done with other people before. Or it has happened with other people with me before, where like sometimes I'll come with an apology and that'll make it easier for them to apologize, or vice versa. If someone has wronged me, and they apologize, it makes it easier for me to examine my own wrongdoings and then apologize for those, because that big initial apology is out of the way.
It's like ripping the Band-Aid off.
Yeah, yeah, and band-aids were ripped. There's another fun. There are quite a few fun exchanges. There's boxing, there's fighting, but the one that stood out to me was the wrestling match between Odysseus and Ajax.
Oh yeah, I love this. Okay, so we did have the same things that stuck out to us because this was the other one that I wanted to talk about.
What do you love so much about this exchange?
It's a stalemate, or at least at one point it is, right?
It's not really so it is. It stays a stale. It's kind of humorous.
It's not a stalemate in terms of a match of pure strength, but it's a stalemate because like Ajax is huge and kind of oafy, but like just has absolute brute strength, and Odysseus is, as he is usually painted, clever, a tactician, a smart guy, and maybe a little bit of a beefcake, as we've talked about before, a little short, a little squat, and he kind of just keeps like knocking Ajax down by like figuring out what he's gonna do and then tripping him.
So there are two sections of the wrestling match. There's the first section where neither man can get the other down, and the people grow bored. And then I think it's Ajax who says, all right, how about we both try to throw each other? We both take turns throwing each other and let Zeus decide who wins. And this may purely be a consequence of the language, but I could not help but think of your favorite Iliad imagery, which is Zeus and his scales.
Yeah, absolutely.
Where both men are sort of literally weighed against each other, and one has to go down and one has to come out on top. And it is quite humorous because Ajax tries to throw Odysseus, and Odysseus trips him. and then Odysseus tries to throw Ajax, and what I can only imagine is a very humorous scene. Odysseus can barely lift Ajax because he's huge, and then he tries to trip him again, and then they go back to wrestling, and then Achilles has to stop the match if I remember
Yeah.
correctly.
Yeah. And as I've mentioned before, like this is one of the many instances of the Iliad where I just think of it like a Looney Tunes cartoon. Because it really just sounds like that. It's like I just imagine Ajax as this like giant immovable object with like little squat Odysseus trying to like push it around. Like not getting anywhere with it.
I'd say between the two of them, Odysseus kind of gets the better of Ajax because he's able to trip him and pin him in one instance, and then the other one it's kind of indecisive.
Yeah, Odysseus is sneaky and
Yeah, and
clever.
and if you recall, I can't remember what this story of Greek myth is called. If you'll recall the part where this is something that Dr. Daniel described in one of his tags, there's a part where after Achilles has died, there's a fight over there's contest over who gets Achilles' arms, and the people involved are Odysseus and Ajax. And even though Ajax is the second best of the Greeks, or I guess the best of the Greeks now that Achilles is dead, Odysseus manages to win the arms through words. He weasels his way into getting Achilles' cool gear, and I can't help but view this as like a little preview of that exchange, even if it is baseless.
Yeah, absolutely. I don't know. I
But
just
yeah.
it's funny. It's just funny. I love the funeral games.
Yeah, there's just a lot of, as I said, this is the most civil we've seen anyone or any peoples in the Iliad. And if we want, we can sort of compare and contrast, if we want, to what happens in this book against what happens in the next book, because these games go on for a while, or rather, it's been a while. I don't know if the games themselves actually go on for a long time. This is the funeral for Patroclus, and it's sort of marked. It's marked by grief and sadness, of course, but there's also a kind of celebratory nature about it, as opposed to the funeral that we're going to get in the next book, which is very much the opposite.
Oh yeah.
And I think that's as good a transition as any, unless you have anything else to say about book 23.
I don't think I have anything major to say. I think there's towards the end of the book, there's a little picture of like the best terms that we've seen Agamemnon and Achilles be on in the entire poem. And I think that was a really kind of interesting glance at like what I was talking about before when we were talking about the dream with Patroclus, of like how great and profound events can really just change things in a relationship between people who have been fighting. I think this is kind of one of those instances where like Agamemnon is, first of all, now satisfied that Achilles has entered and solved his problem, but also kind of recognizes that this is his show. This is Achilles' show. And he's going to kind of stay out of the way a little bit, even though he's going to relish in, the games and some of the fanfare involved with the games and still take his position. He kind of, like, for the first time ever, stands back a little bit and gives that respect to Achilles.
I'd say since book 19, Agamemnon becomes a shadow for the rest of the story, for the rest of the Iliad.
Which just
I don't think he talks
for
anymore.
such a big character, it's interesting to see him fade back so much.
Yeah.
So I think that's the last impression that I really have of book 23. But otherwise, I think it's time to move on to book 24.
Yeah, let's do it. So we'll take a quick break, and when we come back, we will talk about the ultimate book of the Iliad, Achilles and Priam. So stick around.
Hello, dear dear listener, and thanks for sticking with us through our little break. We'll be back in just a couple minutes, but I'd like to take a moment during the break to thank a few people and give a little information about the podcast. First, thank you for listening. This podcast has no sponsor. We've produced everything in-house and on our own time, and if you all are enjoying the fruits of our labor, that is the best thanks we can imagine. You can follow us on Twitter at Homer_bound for new episodes, or just watch our podcast page wherever you're listening to us now. I'd like to thank Wriste for inviting me along on this adventure, which has been such great fun. I'd also like to thank the composer and performer of all the music you've heard throughout the episode, who happens to be my dad. Thanks, Dad. You are the absolute best. I'd also like to thank Bubbo for her contributions to the audio, Webs2D for original art of my llama character, Total Love for additional art and graphic design, and Ghosty for graphic design as well. I'd like to thank our many guests for their time and expertise, and finally, an especially big thank you to Dr. Daniel, who closes out each show with additional insights on our discussions. We hope you'll consider reading along with us. We are using the Robert Fagles translation of the Iliad, and while we try to keep things intelligible for those who are new to the story, you might get more out of our discussions if you've read ahead, so feel free to pause and return later once you've read up. We would also like to remind you to stay tuned after Wriste and I have finished, since Dr. Daniel will have some awesome words of wisdom to add to our discussion. All right. Thanks for hanging out through our break. I will give it back to me and Wriste for the second half of this episode of Homer Bound.
And as promised, we are back. I have refilled my water and stretched my legs. Llama, I assuming you've done the same?
I have done the same. I have more tea. Life is good.
Is it the same tea that you usually tend to have, or is it early enough in the day for you to mix it up from your herbal tea?
Today we have chai. I made some
Hey, I'm drinking chai as well.
Vanilla chai, which is lovely.
Yeah.
A little bit of spice. Yeah, I love chai.
When I was going to school in the mountains, I say in the mountains as if that's like there's a school in the mountains. It's perfectly. I'm not like lumberjacking or anything. The school is located in the mountains.
Go to school in the Himalayas.
Yeah. There was a place that sold loose leaf tea, and so I had chai that way for a while. It was awesome.
Nice. Yeah, I love loose leaf tea. This is not. But I have many loose leaf teas. I have a lot of tea, folks. I really like tea.
I really love chai. It's such a great flavor.
It is a fantastic tea.
Recommended to everyone. But yeah, this is the last book of the Iliad. Not our last book of the Iliad that we're going to talk about. But yeah, book 24. I'm still struggling, or I'm still debating. Why debate, my friend? Why thrash things out? That's where my mind's at. Still debating exactly how I want to cover this. There's obviously the big part in this. Skipping all of the god drama, all of the drama back in Troy with Priam, his children, his wife, his countrymen, everything. Hermes. There's this pivotal, important scene with Priam and Achilles, which, even if you're not familiar with the Iliad, chances are you're familiar with this scene. It's one of the scenes in Troy. That's sort of, it's loosely depicted, but it's depicted nonetheless. And yeah, I guess I'm still trying to determine how to approach this. I will say, I reread this recently today, and as I was going through it, I was surprised because this isn't Achilles' book. Usually when I counter discussions around this, and for good reason, I suppose, because Achilles is sort of the first big name mentioned, one of the first big names mentioned in the Iliad, and he's a pivotal character. But I don't think this book belongs to Achilles.
It belongs to Priam.
It belongs to Priam, but in a way it belongs to Troy. Uh,
Oh, I
it
would absolutely agree with that. I think that's actually a really fantastic way of putting it that I had not thought of before.
yeah, there's there's a lot of through lines that I think you can draw from the start to the end of the Iliad. One big clue, of course, is the name of the Iliad. One of Troy's other many names, I think there's like a couple more, but I don't know them, is Ilium. Iliad is the story, means story of Troy or something like that, or the story of Ilium. And so if we're to read this as that, then this is sort of where they come to terms with what's happening when Troy finally receives Hector from the clutches of Achilles, due to the bravery and wiles of Priam. We're given an extensive grieving scene where all of Troy grieve. We hear from all the women of Troy, and it makes Achilles' contribution feel almost background. Achilles almost gains this sort of, we've talked about how it feels like there are other people in the Iliad who are having their own sort of TV shows or stories.
Yeah, the many spin-offs of the Iliad.
Yeah, the spin-offs. Yeah, like Sarpedon is one of those characters who gives me that impression. And I get that feeling with Achilles almost.
I think it's really fair to say that for book 24. It does kind of just feel background. Or just I'm not sure I would say it's so much that he feels background, but just Priam and Troy's part in this feels so much larger and more profound.
Yeah. That's why I say it feels like this doesn't belong to Achilles, even though I guess we have to talk about Achilles. We have to talk about Achilles' rage and how we can sort of view this as an end to Achilles' rage. I guess we can lead up to it real quick. There's a section where the gods discuss what they're going to do about Hector. Hector's just been sitting there. He's not decaying because Apollo and Aphrodite or whomever are keeping him fresh, but the other gods like, oh, we can never honor Hector with the same level of Achilles because Achilles is born of a god, Hector's not, and Zeus agrees, but he's also like, hey, Hector's done me some solids. And so he sets the scene, he sets the stage for Priam's meeting with Achilles by sending off messages. He sends Thetis to Achilles to have Achilles, when Priam comes with a ransom, to accept the ransom. And he sends Iris off to Priam to have Priam gain the courage to make this journey to the Achaean camp with his ransom. And I guess this was the first part that surprised me because I've actually been ready. I've been ready this whole time to sort of highlight what's changed about Achilles here. If you remember in the first book, Achilles, the first time he faces down a king in the Iliad, a god has to step in to turn him away. Athena has to stop him from killing Agamemnon. And I was ready to say, you know what? The gods don't need to intervene with Achilles because Achilles has grown as a person or something like that. But after rereading this, I was like, oh, a lot of the work is done by the gods.
Yeah.
There's been this question that I think we've run into a few times, which is, where does agency really lie? And like, does it lie with people, with the mortals, or does it lie with the gods? And it's in this book in particular where I was thinking, I'm not even sure if that's the right question to ask about this particular world, because it's kind of the will is kind of one and the same. like the mortals sacrifice to the gods what they want, and the gods will sometimes give them what they want, but you're also supposed to listen to the gods, and the gods will ultimately get what they want, but they can be bargained with. And so fate is this sort of ongoing negotiation that's inexorably entangled with the gods. There's no like mortals and the gods. They're together. They're always together. There's no like, oh, there's mortal will and then there's the gods will. It's like they're mixed and spaghetti together.
Yeah, absolutely. I was just thinking about it as almost kind of like a tug of war, but one where the teams are like constantly like losing people to the other side, you know? There's people like are, oh, I'm going to go over to that side and pull on that side now, and I'm going to over to this other side and pull this side now, and just all like complete confusion. Then there's one person in the middle who's like, this is not how you play tug of war. What are you all doing?
It's almost like a tumbleweed
Yeah, a
where
little
like
bit. Just catching whatever it
the
rolls
individual parts
across.
are not nearly so important as the whole itself. It's all being pulled along by itself because it's all entangled. You know, we see all these promises and these oaths made to gods and by gods, and more oaths come out of those oaths,
Yeah, and it's
and
like
on
the
and on we go.
momentum is carrying itself.
So I wonder like how much validity the question of like free will or agency even really has. Like we're operating on such different paradigms of like moral and like philosophical reality that like that kind of question, especially in this book, as I said, because so much is set up by the gods and no one really bats an eye about it. Same sort of thing with this is sort of thing. This is the thing I skipped over in book 23, where it's like people don't really seem to mind that the gods are involved. Like they'll pray to them sometimes they won't. It depends on what they want or how bad they want it. And if someone wins because of God's favor, that's it's not like, oh, you didn't do this, a god did this. It's like you did this, like
Yeah.
you. And if the god helps you, they're part of you too, or that's part of you that they helped you, if that makes any sense.
Yeah, and I think it speaks to something that, Dr. Daniel has mentioned numerous times in his tags, which are just like how much more of a fact of life these gods were
Mm-hmm.
to this time period, this culture, than we take for granted. We take that for granted
Mm-hmm.
today, in
Yeah.
that, someone who is, not so religious like me, or, and I know you've said you're not really a super religious person, like, you kind
I
of
was
take
raised religious, but
for granted that, oh, you can kind of pick and choose. But
mm-hmm.
this was absolutely not the case. This is a fact of life. The gods are a fact of life, and just woven into daily life. So, like, that they would kind of not dismiss, but like say, yeah, well, that's just, it is what it is. The gods are here. What are you going to do
Yeah.
about it? Makes sense.
Yeah, no, no. I guess I stumbled upon this. I don't know if you can call it an epiphany, but it made some things make less sense and more sense. I don't know. I'm still trying to figure out because again, I just thought about this today as I was rereading it. Um, yeah, I don't know. We'll I'll shelve that for. We'll talk about this more in the Odyssey, where we
Oh,
see
I'm sure
more
we will.
overt godly intervention. And in fact, we'll get to encounter it in like the first book, I think, which
Oh,
will be
yeah.
very fun. So we can sort of put a pin in that. Kind of move on again. Zeus has set the stage. Priam then, as designed by Zeus, he resolves to ransom his son Hector's body. He goes against the will of his wife, and against the caution of everyone else. And Zeus sends him a sign. He goes out in the night, I think. Maybe it's not the night. I can't remember the time of day. Hermes helps him along, and then we finally get to our main scene with Priam and Achilles. This is one of those, I guess, big deal scenes that, as I said, everyone seems to be familiar with. Were you
Yeah.
familiar with this scene like before you'd read it?
I actually wasn't. I don't think that I had ever. I know actually pretty much for sure that I had not gotten to the end of the Iliad, and I don't think this was ever really discussed. We always I feel like the chapters that I read were the big Achilles chapters, which kind of makes
Mm-hmm. Of
sense, you know,
course.
being that everyone seems to focus on Achilles. But reading this chapter, this book, was like so profound for me. It's just such a heartbreaking conversation in so many ways. You know, the grief of Priam, the grief of Achilles intermingled with each other, the pity of Achilles, which, you know, kind of starts being glanced off in the beginning of the book when he's kind of tossing and turning in his sleep and thinking of Patroclus and then dragging Hector's. This is, by the way, the part where he drags Hector's body around, is at the very,
Okay.
like, it's on page 2 of this book. Um, that he, you know, gets Hector's body and drags him around a few times and then just, you know, goes on raging. And but that pity, I think starting off on that note that Achilles has begun to pity Hector, you know, this dead man that he's dragging around every now and then to like relieve his grief.
Don't know if
It's
he pities Hector. Where do you get that?
well, it literally says
Does it?
um hold on.
I mean, if that's so, then then I.
Um Oh, it says, I'm sorry, Apollo pitied Hector. I misread that.
Okay, yeah.
But I know though that there is some point where he starts his mood turns. And it is, I think, during this conversation with Priam. But for me it does seem like he
Yes.
does eventually come to pity him and what he's done to him. But I did misread that.
So what I and I'll talk. I like to talk, I guess, more holistically about the Iliad. After having talked about this in more specific, book-specific terms, but in this section, what I'm getting from it is that Priam is asking Achilles to think of his own old father, and this has been done a couple times. In fact, this has been sort of hinted at, or what's the word, foreshadowed, or iterated upon throughout the Iliad. What stands out to me is in book 16 when Patroclus is coming to Achilles in tears, and Achilles says, like, what's happened? The only bad thing that I could think of is if we received news that our fathers were dead. Achilles seems to, I don't know what his relationship is like with Peleus, his father, but he seems to hold him in high regard, if not personal, then perhaps emotional. I think this has come up a couple of the times in different ways, but I can't remember where. And so when Priam says your father will be happy to hear that you're alive, even though he's old and tired, but I will never feel this way again. What happens is Achilles, he knows the truth. He knows that he's not going to live. And so when Priam says, you know, your father will delight to hear that you're alive still, but I'll never do that, he's actually sort of conjuring up the negative in Achilles. Achilles realizes that is called to remember that his father will never have this pleasure again, this joy again, and he gets to empathize with someone who isn't himself, or perhaps Patroclus for the first time.
Imagine that.
Priam literally, inadvertently or otherwise, teaches him how to empathize by showing himself in this way, and that's what gets Achilles going. That's where his mood shifts to tears. Priam cries for his own son, and Achilles, sort of by extension, cries for his own father because of his own death, because of his own inevitable death, and for Patroclus because he's also still sad about Patroclus.
Yeah. I think one of my favorite parts of this is when they're kind of just staring at each other. and like regarding each other and kind of letting that fully sink in. I love the description of just like Priam looking at Achilles' beauty, and Achilles just seeing how like noble and regal Priam looks. It's around line
Hmm.
740, and just that image of them kind of standing there looking at this person who has made such an impact on their life, you know?
The other surprising image that I wasn't super ready for was that there are other people in the room. This is not a private conversation. In the movie Troy, it's very one on one, he's in his tent alone, but there are just some of the Myrmidons there hanging out. And they're like watching. They've noticed that Priam is in there, which I don't know what it adds to me. It was just I guess a surprising bit of scene dressing that I had always sort of blotted out of my mind. This seems like a very personal one-on-one, like
Well, it's such an
dark lonely room.
emotionally charged
Yeah.
conversation. And I really like the way that they portrayed it in Troy because it feels right, but it's not what happens. There's a
Hmm.
bunch of serving men and women in the room. There's aides at arms of
Automedon and
Achilles, there's people just sitting there and watching all of this and like attending to Achilles and
mhm.
at Priam and to Priam at Achilles' request during this whole thing and after it. And just like, oh, that's a little awkward.
And as we well know, Achilles relents to Priam's request. Priam has arrived with a great ransom for his son's body, and this is sort of a somewhat ironic echo of what Achilles insisted in front of the Scaean gates, the gates of Troy, when he killed Hector, when he said, even if Dardan Priam weighs out your bulk in gold, I'll never give you back, and yet here he is. And how much Achilles is doing this because he was commanded to by his mother, and how much he's doing this because he feels it's the correct thing to do is uncertain. As usual, I believe Achilles when he shares in Priam's grief, when he conjures up the image of his own father and and sees that image in Priam. But I don't know exactly. Kind of going back on my whole agency and free will thing. I'm still mired in my own conceptions of this. I still don't know how to like. Do I credit Achilles with this, or do I view this in the same way as like Odysseus winning the foot race because Athena drove him on? It's not like it's Odysseus does win the foot race, and Athena just happened to be there to help him, but that doesn't mean that he didn't win. Like, do I view Achilles in the same way? He was helped along by the message from Thetis, from his mother, but he still did it. Yeah, that's
I think
that's.
I think it's I think that's a question that I personally like don't feel like I can answer, but for the same reasons, just like it there's so much back and forth with it that I go through of like this is all very obviously influenced by the gods. Without Zeus and Thetis and Iris, carrying all these messages to all of these individual people, would
Hermes.
this actually happen? You know? But at the same time, like, there's part of me that wonders that if Priam came with this appeal on his own without these messages from the gods, like, is there some part of Achilles that would have taken pity on him and given him his son back? I think it's possible, actually. I think that the way that he's been touched by Patroclus's grief, I think there's that opening, in the door for Priam to get his foot in at least.
And just the same, like you say, like with the. I mean, I've said as well. Yeah, yeah. I'm just stealing your phrasing, but like you said, like this happened without the gods, and I guess I wonder like there is no without the gods. Like the
Exactly.
gods
Oh,
are
absolutely.
around always. Like they're there at the games, they're there for the mice and the frogs, and they're there for the great warriors. It's just all over the place. So
The
Like,
gods
what
are
is
a reality, period.
so what is even the point
Of
uh
asking.
of asking this
I don't know, for
question? Yeah,
fun.
like, is it
For our amusement, obviously.
from
Yeah.
modern perspective, it makes plenty of sense, but like we can't. It's so hard. Like, I don't.
But the question is,
This is
can
this
you
is why
really
I'm.
look at, a story like the Iliad through the lens of a modern perspective? Or do you just have to take it where it's at?
You can. Your eyes are gonna burn a little bit though. And yeah. What happens afterwards? Again, it's fairly straightforward. There's no wild twist. Priam brings Hector back. We hear from all the ladies of Troy, including Helen. I can't remember if earlier we or I asserted that, okay, this is probably the last time we hear from Helen, but nope, she's in the last scene. She's in the ending pre-credits scene with I think with Hecuba and Andromache, and a lot of attention is given to this funeral that is being held for Hector. Achilles promises time for the funeral. Achilles asks, I think, very much so informed by his own funeral that he held for Patroclus. He asks Priam, how many days do you need to hold this funeral? Priam says like 12 days or 13 days or
Yeah.
something like that.
I mean, as always, ritual reigns supreme, and Achilles is, well, it's true though. Like,
Mm-hmm.
Achilles is not going to break, his honor with ruining the ritual that he is now assenting to. So it makes complete sense that he would give them that time. And I believe that he would stick to it completely. Like, there's no way that I would believe that, he's going to go back on his word to do that.
I think you're right, especially off the back of something so ritualistically or culturally significant. So before this was a few days earlier, I believe. I talked about analysis and synthesis. We hear about it all the time in school. You can analyze something, then you have to bring it all together. It's one thing to talk about to like break something apart and talk about its individual opponents or components, and then it's another thing to bring it all together. And while I'm not sure how well equipped I am to do it, I think that's just, at least one academic ritual that we ought to observe
I
as
agree
we close out
wholeheartedly.
on on the Iliad. I guess there was that question that you mentioned that we put a pin in a couple episodes ago, which was can you remind me what the question was? It was
I want to say it had to do with like my assessment of the Iliad holistically, since I've now read it more completely than I ever had. I
yeah,
think it was
what about
something
this
along those
reread
lines.
as stood out to you sort of holistically? And as an example, I think I said for me the biggest thing was reading with an eye toward the prayer and the role of Achilles in this whole thing.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's a big thing that stands out to me. I think I think one of the bigger things was like when I read this in high school, I don't think I appreciated the oral tradition aspect of it. And since that has been something that Dr. Daniel has brought up a number of times, we've talked about it a number of times. I think reading with that in mind has actually really changed my perspective of the Iliad as a story. Because I kept finding myself going back to it as something that was being performed as well as me reading it. So that was a game changer for me. And then I think the other thing was actually Kira Jones blowing my mind. Dr. Kira Jones talking about the shield of Achilles and that kind of revelation that I think you and I both had about the significance of the shield. And since we did that episode, I can't stop thinking about it.
I
In
think we've referenced it in like all of our
We
discussions.
have, because it blew my mind. Absolutely blew my mind. But I think it speaks to a greater theme in the poem about choices and wearing one's choices as a literal piece of armor, and how that theme is just so pervasive throughout the entire Iliad. The choices that Achilles makes, the choices that Agamemnon makes, that Hector make, that Patroclus make, like they're all, I think choices is a word that just comes to mind to me a lot. And with that, this conversation that we've been having in terms of this and the last book about agency and, the gods and the lack of agency, or the kind of yo-yo act of, do they have agency or do they not? And it all comes back to choices, and like, what choices do they
The
really
agency
have?
of the gods and the mortals are sort of alloyed together in this
Yeah,
weird.
absolutely. So that's another thing that I think has kind of taken over my thought when I read this now, is kind of looking for those situations where they do or don't have choices, and how much of a choice are they really?
I think the next time I read through the Iliad, which hopefully will be another translation, I think that'd be very interesting. But one of the things that I think I'll keep in mind the next time around, now that I've raged myself against Achilles, um, is sort of reading it with this sort of hybrid sense of like what it means to have agency or choice in a world where gods are ubiquitous and ever present and always acting. But acting at a very, as I've mentioned before, like the the will of the gods is still very physical and like touchable and palpable. Like what that means or looks like. I don't know, it'll be interesting to reapproach it with that in mind.
Yeah. I mean, look, I've talked about how I reread Lord of the Rings like every year. I think I'm adding, maybe not every year, but I'm definitely adding the Iliad to my list of rereadable content,
You'll keep it on the
because
shelf.
I think it's one of these things that, like, the same way that it does for me with Lord of the Rings, it will change and evolve as I keep reading it more and more, and as I age and gain more knowledge in life. Like, and this is why I love this as a classic story. I mean, the name classics, he's a classics major. He is a professor of classics. Like, there is a reason that it is called that. There is a reason that this is called a classic. And I think this experience has made me realize that more than I ever had before.
So in terms of synthesis, in terms of bringing all of these books together, maybe not as like they're sort of microscopic pieces or whatever, because as I said before, there are many through lines that we can draw uh, if we want, and so when we synthesize all of this, obviously, as with everything, it'll probably be different for different people. Some people will choose to focus on Achilles. Some people might choose to focus on Hector. Some people might choose to focus on certain themes or emotions. This process of synthesis. Do you want to? I guess have you been able to have you had the time to think about and synthesize everything in a way that makes you happy?
I think the more that I think about synthesizing things, the less I'm actually able to do it.
Mm.
In the sense that, like, as you just said, there are so many possible ways to do it, and I
Mm.
can see so many of them. Um, I think you talked about this a little bit a short while ago. Like, the name the Iliad is important, because I think ultimately this is the story of Troy, and that is kind of how I synthesize it. It's interesting how that ends up happening, but that is where the poem ends. And as much as it is a story about Achilles and his rage, it all seems very, like, contained by the location. I don't know kind of where that's coming from, but that's just like my instinct on it. It's like,
We don't fade out on Achilles' face. We fade it out on
exactly.
all of Troy.
Exactly. And also, the very source of Achilles' rage comes from the goings on in the war in Troy.
Yeah, and if I were to pick a character, in our lost conversation on books 21 and 22, I sort of blithely said our main character Achilles, brushing over any like debate we could have, but just for simplicity's sake, not for dismissal of
Oh yeah.
other viewpoints' sake. But especially after reading this, like Hector is a strong contender for the main character position
Okay, so this was
because
the
he is
thing.
very.
Oh, please finish.
I was just gonna say this is his influence is felt throughout the book.
So what I was gonna say was
Okay,
this
go on.
reminds me of one of those like this is a conversation I've had with people in terms of like have you ever watched one of those like HBO or Showtime series where you can't really pick who the main character is because it's all just like a leading cast of character actors?
Yes, I can think of a couple. Sure.
So this is what that reminds me of. I don't think there
Mm.
actually is a main character in the Iliad. I know that most people would
Yeah,
say that it's
yeah.
Achilles, but I think it is that that
There are at least a
um
couple reasonable contenders.
yeah, exactly. Like there's Achilles, but there's also Hector. There's also Zeus. I think Zeus is absolutely a main character. Um, I think, Agamemnon is a contender for that as well. Patroclus is a contender for that as well, even though he doesn't appear as much, but his presence looms like a specter over the entire thing until he dies, and even after he dies. So there's just so many people who are so important to the story that I don't think it's fair to say that there's one main character.
To say that there is a main character, I think would, while not necessarily be totally inaccurate, would also do a disservice to like everything else that's happening because there are so many characters. Like to say, oh, this is our main character, focus on that. I think would might easily distract from what I think is a more interesting and perhaps better way of reading the Iliad. I've So I guess with my own synthesis, I've been trying to I've been trying to work it out, I guess. And one of the things that I think is fairly typical of like a modern story, and perhaps this is true of ancient stories as well. I don't know. Um, but is the synthesis is extracting the moral of the story. We've all heard this like, what's the moral of the story? What's it saying? What is it trying to tell us? But usually that saying is like moral, like you should do this or you shouldn't do that. And in book 24, I mean, yes, empathy, good, but we've already known we didn't need book 24 to tell us that, right? We're just seeing it shake out. We've known this for a good while. If you're paying attention to Achilles, you know that his behavior is bad and that someone like Patroclus is like a little better. And so walking away from this with something like that, I think would be a mistake. You could take away a message perhaps about family or legacy or something. But what stood out to me, and this made more sense to me as we went along, is exhaustion. Yeah, I've mentioned before, or I mentioned before that like I feel exhausted for Hector
Oh yeah.
as he like goes down and he's like picked back up and he's like the paramedics like he's just shock his heart back to like, oh, here you go out back out
Oh
there.
yeah, he's
He's
just
like,
like
let
dragged
me out.
around like a rag doll.
I mean, that exhaustion isn't just his; it's all of Troy's.
Oh yeah.
And but past that, I mean, and also, Hector, as a, I think we mentioned in our lost conversation, our lost episode 11, Hector rages as well. Hector is raging with Troy at his back, and regardless of how we want to view the moral properties of like the rage of Achilles against like the rage of Hector, they're both raging, and I feel exhausted for Achilles as well. In book 16, he says Patroclus, who can keep raging forever, but he keeps refreshing it and renewing it. And after a while, I'm just like, man, I'm tired of reading all of this because rage is such a heightened
Oh
emotion.
yeah.
Like you don't feel rage forever; you feel it for a while.
Well, it's like also anyone who's ever had like a serious adrenaline rush knows
Yeah.
that after that wears off, you crash. And you
Hmm.
can feel that. Like it is palpable that you just feel everyone kind of just crash after this adrenaline rush ends after Hector dies. And everyone is kind of
Yeah.
not just at rest, but like at crash, at, exhaustion point, because there's just been so much.
It's not just, I mean, it's not just the rage. It's also like I feel the same way. I feel very similar about Achilles, his grief. Grief is another. I remember a discussion I had in college in one of my classes about how it was one person who was frustrated by grief because they're like, yeah, I can't continue to have these strong emotions for something that I feel I should feel strongly about. Like I can only grieve for so long before that sort of dies away. We have all these heightened emotions, even love, right? Even love. It depends on how you want to read the story of Helen in Paris. But if you want to read it as Helen sort of following her heart, stricken with love, that too sort of fades into something else, and hopefully, when that fades, you hope there's something there to keep it going. But for her, I guess not. The war has soured things.
New. And in fact, one of the last things she says before we leave off with her is like, "Oh God, there's no one around here anymore who's nice to me,"
Mm-hmm.
and that strikes me honestly because like Paris is standing right there. Um, and but Hector is the last person who was good to her, really.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, I remember that part where she said that. It was, yeah,
It's
it stood
heartbreaking,
out.
honestly, and we'll see how things change in that department in the Odyssey.
But yeah. Anyway, to wrap things up, as I said, I felt I was reading about like the most exhausting thing in the world, and the Shield of Achilles sort of helps bring it together for me because rage and other such strong emotions like grief or whatever, they don't last forever. It's not even that they shouldn't last forever. It's just that they don't. War only gets like a relatively small part of the shield. The rest is just
Life.
business as usual. Yeah, life, and life goes on. It's not a value thing even. It's not even that like, oh, it's not. I don't even think it's saying like rage is bad or rage is good because we have
No, just
Achilles' rage,
rage.
which is very destructive, and we have Hector's rage, which is like we feel better about it. At least I do. It's
Rage
just
is rage.
it ends. It ends
It's
eventually.
finite.
Yeah, and when Achilles like gives up Hector to Priam, I feel like he can breathe. I feel like he can like his rage gets to end, not
Yeah.
because it's like bad or I mean maybe it is bad, but not because it's bad, but just because that's what happens. It runs out and things move. I mean, the war obviously still isn't over. It's going to keep going. But eventually life will go on for everyone, whether they like it or
Yeah.
not.
And one of my favorite things, and I don't know how this varies from translation to translation, but I think one of the things that demonstrates that the most fittingly for me is the very last line in the Iliad as translated by Robert Fagles, which is, "And so the Trojans buried Hector, breaker of horses." And that's what it ends on. And that is just that symbol of, life is finite, rage is finite. All of these things come to an end, except for the gods, which are immortal.
It's not
It's
even that it
these things
like when it
pass, though. These things in their own way, I think, are immortal. Rage is immortal because everyone at some point in their life will feel that. And it's not going to cease to exist after someone dies. It just picks up with the next person who becomes
mm,
living. These things are all immortal, but they are also finite and they pass. And that is kind of like the circle of life. I don't know. It is at all times ongoing and also ending.
turns out even Achilles' rage is imperfect.
Yeah.
It it ends. Who can keep raging on forever and ever?
Yeah, that's such a great line.
So yeah, Achilles had it, whether he knew it or not. I think at least that's how this reading of the Iliad comes together for me. I guess is that all this exhausting, finite sort of feelings and events.
Yeah, I love that.
So there's
And
there's
that,
a there's
friends, is the
all she
Iliad.
wrote.
We have come to the end of the first great poem.
Yeah, exciting. I'm still, of course, excited to hear what Dr. Daniel has to say about our discussion.
Definitely.
As always, and of course, we'll be meeting with him. It's what, Wednesday today. We'll be meeting with him on Saturday to talk about books 21 and 22. So we'll be
To
backtracking.
do our own little episode of Doctor Who where we go back in time.
But not for you. For you, the
For
viewers, the
you,
readers,
this
whatever.
will have already happened. And what are we even
Absolutely.
talking about?
Time is
what are you
convoluted.
Yeah.
But yeah, so thank you, Llama, for going on this adventure with me.
Yeah.
I know you had to tolerate much in order to go through it, but
And I will
we're halfway
continue to
through.
have to do so.
Absolutely, because we have the Odyssey coming up.
The Odyssey is coming up. I'm very excited. And
Yeah, so don't,
Here we
as
are.
usual, stick around to hear
listen
Dr.
to Dr.
Daniel's
Dan.
last word. Yes,
Listen to him.
And you'll get to hear more of him in the next episode, where we will be opening on the Odyssey, books 1 and 2. We'll have his guiding force to lead us from one translation into another, and from one part of the epic cycle into the other. So yeah, without further ado, here's Dr. Daniel.
Hello everybody, my name is Daniel, otherwise known as Dr. Daniel, Dr. Dan, or the Dancing Grad, and I'm here to offer some thoughts on Wriste and Llama's conversation about Iliad books 23 and 24. We made it to the end of the Iliad, and there's some really great topics that Wriste and Llama touched on in their conversation that I want to pick up on and talk a little bit more about, namely talking about the funeral games that are in book 23 for Patroclus, the actual appearance of Patroclus to Achilles as a ghost in book 23 as well, and then focusing in on the actual end of the Iliad in book 24 and how we actually focus in more on Troy than we do on Greece. First of all, the idea of holding funeral games to honor the dead was not a practice that began in the time period of the writing of the Iliad or the composing of the Iliad. It actually seems to extend pretty far back, at least to the period of early Mycenaean Greece in the second millennium BCE. These were funeral games that were held in honor of very prominent individuals, for example, heroes in war, city founders, and they were meant to honor the deceased and seemed to be aimed at soothing or propitiating their spirits. Some scholars see in the funeral games actually the progenitor of the Olympic Games, and you can see that in the way that the sports actually work out, and as they are described in Book 23. These funeral games are, of course, in honor of Patroclus, who has been dead since Book 16 and still remains unburied as of Book 23, because Achilles can't bring himself to let go. But as we've discussed before, this is really not great, because without burial, a soul cannot rest. To remain unburied, like Patroclus is, and even like Hector is at this point of the story, that was an offense to the gods. So Patroclus seems to take the initiative here to appear to Achilles in a dream to try to convince him to let go. One of my favorite parts of the discussion between Wriste and Llama about this part of Book 23 was the discussion about the idea of this ghost appearing and what that might say about the relationship between Achilles and Patroclus at this point in time. Is this a real visit from the shade of Patroclus? Is it a projection of Achilles' imagination? Either way, I wanted to return to the original Greek and focus in on some key terms when the poet is describing what Patroclus looks like. The Greek at Book 23, lines 65 through 67 reads as follows: Elthedepi psuke patrokleios de loio, pantau to megathos te kai homata kai e equia, kai phonein, kai toia perikroi e mata esto. With a literal translation as follows: the soul, the spirit, the psuche of wretched Patroclus came to him. appearing in every respect like him, in stature, megathos, his beautiful eyes, homatakala, and his voice, phonein. And he was clothed in such clothes around his body. And the word for such there, toia, seems to indicate the clothes that Patroclus would have worn as he was alive. The spirit of Patroclus seems pretty personified and active here. The verb that begins this entire thing is elthe, from the verb erkomai, meaning to come or to go. So literally the psyche elthe, the soul arrived. But in terms of the appearance of the soul, of the psyche Patrokleos, the soul of Patroclus, a really interesting word is used. Eiquia, which is a verbal participle that basically means to seem like or to appear like. So it has to do with appearance, but appearances always have to do with perception, specifically the way that outside forces perceive what they're seeing. So this vision of Patroclus, with his stature, megathos, his beautiful eyes, homatakala, and his voice and such clothes as he wore when he was alive, as opposed to the clothes that he was wearing now that he's dead, seem to point to a picture that Achilles wants to see. This psychological attachment really amps up the stakes and makes this a really affective, emotional experience for us as readers as we see Achilles seeing his beloved Patroclus for pretty much the last time. It becomes even more emotional after Patroclus makes his request of Achilles to let him be buried. After Achilles has spoken back to him in return, this is how the Greek goes at lines 99 through 101. Hosarafone sas orexato kersi phelesin udelabe, psyche de kataktonos eute kapnos oketo tetriguia. A little translation here is Achilles spoke in this way, and he reached out with his own hands, but he couldn't take hold. The spirit, namely the spirit of Patroclus, like smoke, went down below the earth, wailing a shrill cry, tetriguia. If this vision of Patroclus is a projection of Achilles, then it's a really cruel one that his mind is creating here. He reaches out with his own hands, but he can't grab hold of the thing that he wants the most, to be with Patroclus again. And the ghost of Patroclus himself disappears, vanishes like a wisp of smoke. This interaction between Achilles and Patroclus serves as the preamble to the funeral games that take up the rest of Book 23. And there's one part of the games that I want to focus in on that Llama and Wriste brought up in their conversation. They pointed out how Fagles, in true Fagles fashion, seems to have been having a bit of fun with his translation when he translates Menelaos as saying something to the effect of, Antilochus, hold your horses, during a chariot race. We've seen before that Fagles, as a translator, is prone to having a bit of fun with his translations, and using English colloquialisms that might seem out of place in an ancient context. However, I'm happy to report that in this case, Fagles is actually rendering the Greek exactly right. The line in question comes at line 424 of Book 23 of the Iliad, and the Greek reads as follows: Antilochafradeos hippasdeai al-lanakippus. Antilochus, you drive your chariot without any thought, thoughtlessly, so aphradeos there, that adverb, al-anakippus, but literally, hold your horses. Aneko, to hold, and hippus, meaning horses. So apparently the idiom is much more ancient than we might think. Then we come to Book 24, the end of a very long journey that we began all the way back in Book 1. But when we think about the things that happened in Book 1, and the ways that they might or might not map onto the things that happened in Book 24, we can draw some really interesting conclusions. Remember that the entire poem begins with Meinen aede thea, Peleia dio Achilleos ulomenein, sing goddess about the wrath of the son of Peleus, Achilles, the baneful wrath. And the story of the Iliad is basically the story of Achilles working through that menace, working through that wrath, which is initially aimed at Agamemnon and then gets aimed at Hector. However, the title of the poem is not the Achilleid. It's the Iliad, coming from the name Ilium for Troy. So if we want to hold on to this idea that the meanness of Achilles is what drives the entire story of the Iliad, we have to reconcile that idea with what happens here in Book 24. Achilles is still holding onto his wrath at Hector for killing Patroclus well into Book 24 until the moment when Priam comes directly to Achilles to beg for his son's body back. Priam's winning gambit here capitalizes on the very first description that we got of Achilles in line 1 of Book 1 of the poem, Achilles, son of Peleus. Here in Book 24, Priam evokes the image of Achilles' father to try to get him to pity Priam enough to hand Hector's body over. At lines 503 to 506 in the Greek, this is how it reads in Priam's speech to Achilles. Alai deotius, Achilleo, auton teleeson, mnesamenos tu patros, ego dele enoterosper, et lendoi po tis epikthonios protosalos, andros paedophenoio potisto macer oregestai. But have respect for the gods, Achilles, because remember that an unburied body was in front of the gods. And take pity on me, while being mindful of your own father, mnesamenos su patros. But I am even more wretched, I am even more pitiable, and I underwent what no mortal on earth has yet had to endure. I am bringing to my own mouth the hands of the man who killed my son, andros paedophenoio. It's this appeal and this invocation of Peleus that causes Achilles to relent, to finally let go of his meanness and allow Priam to take his son's body back to bury it. Once Achilles relinquishes his claim, the focus of the narrative shifts entirely to Troy, and I want to hone in here on the very last line of the entire poem, after the burial of Hector. This is how Fagles renders the final line of the Iliad, and so the Trojans buried Hector, breaker of horses. This renders the Greek pretty faithfully in all but one aspect that I'll talk about in 1 second, but the Greek is as follows. Hos hoi ganthia pon taphon hectoros hippodemoio. Thus they busied themselves about the burial of Hector, the breaker of horses, with that very common epithet that we see usually attached to Hector's name. Hector, tamer of horses, or breaker of horses. The verb of this line, however, is amphiapon, from the verb amphiepo, to busy themselves around a certain task. But what's really interesting about this verb is sort of a minute grammatical point, but one that has really interesting meta-narrative implications for the story. The verb is in the imperfect tense, which is the tense that you use in Greek when you want to indicate an action that occurred in the past over a period of time, for an action that is continuous or even unfinished. So the use of the imperfect tense in the very last line of the Iliad does not indicate, like one would expect, a sense of finality or closure to the story of the Iliad. It implies that there's still something more to it, that there's still something happening, that something is still ongoing or continuous as opposed to being closed or final. Maybe this is a clever nod to the connection that the Iliad has with other works of the epic cycle. We know that the Iliad and the Odyssey were not the only works of ancient Greek epic, because there's still a lot of stuff that happened around the Trojan War that the Iliad and the Odyssey do not cover. So perhaps this end, quote-unquote, to the Iliad is not really quite an end at all, but invites us to think about the ways that this story connects to the other ones around it. But that's about all I have for this tag. Thank you all for listening, and I'll throw it back now to Wriste and Llama.
Thank you so much, Dr. Daniel, and thank you once again, dear listener, for tuning in. We hope you've enjoyed our discussion as well as Dr. Daniel's wonderfully informative expert opinions. We also hope you'll take the opportunity to continue reading along with us, since there is still plenty to love about these stories. Keep an eye out for future episodes by following us on Twitter at Homer_bound, or wherever you happen to be listening to us right now. We're looking forward to seeing you for the next episode, but until next time, take care and thank you for joining us for this episode of Homer Bound.